So this is our second lesson on the popular protest between 1780 and 1885 of our final little series. Now we're moving on to the Merthyr Rising of 1831. Merthyr Tydfil was a large industrial town that grew rapidly in the 19th century due to its iron industry. The workers of Merthyr were generally nonconformists, whereas the industrialists whom dominated the town were members of the Church of England, so they were Anglicans. The people of Merthyr participated in the rising for a variety of reasons, but the vast majority of them were economic. For instance, the workers detested the hated truck system, which put a corporate monopoly on all business in the area and charged extortionate prices for basic commodities. There was also an economic depression between 1829 and 1831, which badly hit the iron industry. There were some political aspects to the Merthyr Rising, such as the reform crisis, because the workers and industrialists generally supported the reform bills and held demonstrations advocating their passing. Ultimately, the immediate cause of the rising was the wage cuts at Crawshay's Cyfarthfa Iron Works and the sacking of 84 employees on May 23rd, 1831, 1 week before the rising. The rising began on May 31st, when the authority of the detested Court of Requests was challenged as bailiffs were prevented from seizing property of a worker called Lewis. A compromise was made when the magistrate from Merthyr persuaded Lewis to give up his trunk to the court. However, on June 1st, a crowd of workers attacked the home of a shopkeeper whom had bought Lewis's trunk, and the trunk was returned to Lewis. On the morning of June 2nd, a huge crowd entered Merthyr and attacked the home of Thomas Williams, a local bailiff, and property was seized from debtors by the court was taken away. On the evening of June 2nd, iron workers from Cyfarthfa joined the crowd as they marched to the house of Thomas Lewis, a hated moneylender. The riot was becoming more than a civil disturbance. Now it was a challenge to the rule of law. The Merthyr magistrate, J.B. Bruce, responded to the protest by setting up a headquarters at the Castle Inn, enrolling 70 special constables, warning the authorities in Brecon for the possible need for military assistance in Merthyr, and reading the riot act to the crowd in a hope that they would disperse. However, the crowd ignored the act. In the evening of June 2nd, the house of Joseph Coffin, president of the Court of Requests, was attacked, and all records of debts were burned. Bruce then called for military aid, and 52 soldiers from the 93rd Highlanders left for Merthyr, arriving on June 3rd. The troops were stationed at Castle Inn, where they were surrounded by a crowd of 10,000 rioters. The rioters shouted for higher wages and uttered Caws gyda bara, which is Welsh for cheese with the bread, but their demands were denied. Lewis then called for the rioters to seize the guns of the soldiers. The soldiers responded by firing into the crowd, killing 20 civilians and injuring many more, and 16 soldiers were also wounded, including Donald Black. The HQ was then moved to Penydarren Ironworks, as it was easier to defend while troops from Brecon and an ammunition train from Swansea were on their way. Once the reinforcements had arrived on June 6th, 400 soldiers were sent to attack a gathering of 12,000 to 20,000 rioters on Warn Hill. The riot act was read and the soldiers attacked, causing the crowd to swiftly disperse. The soldiers then searched the town for weapons, and 18 ringleaders, including Lewis and Dick Pendrin, were arrested. Both were sentenced to death, but Lewis had his sentence commuted to transportation. Dick Pendrin was executed for the stabbing of Donald Black in the thigh. However, it is disputable as to whether or not Pendrin was actually guilty. So, that's it for the Merthyr Rising. Just 1 year after that, we've got the Days of May and the Reform Crisis, because obviously we mentioned before the Merthyr Rising that they were holding demonstrations for the Reform Crisis, so this is all kind of happening at the same time. So if you want to talk about this kind of stuff as extra parliamentary pressure in your parliamentary reform essay, feel free to do that and include the Merthyr Rising as well as the Days of May and possibly Bristol riots in your extra parliamentary causes for the passing of the 1832 Reform Act. Because obviously all of this extra parliamentary pressure kind of got Wellington and a lot of the other Tories and the Commons and Lords to believe that they had to concede and that reform had to go ahead if Britain was to avoid being plunged into a revolution. So, I digress. The Days of May in 1832. The Days of May appeared to present a very serious revolutionary threat to the government. When the Tories blocked the Third Reform Bill, the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, handed in his resignation, and Arthur Wellesley formed a very short-lived government. The radicals were enraged by the failure of the bill, so they began rioting, campaigning for economic sabotage, and threatening armed insurrection. During a meeting of delegates from various political unions, including the BPU, Francis Place produced the slogan, "To stop the Duke, go for gold," which threatened a bank run where everyone holding paper money would exchange it for gold in the bank, thus causing a bank run and depleting the UK's gold stocks and causing financial collapse. Thomas Attwood's Birmingham Political Union also put significant pressure on the government to introduce another bill. According to the diary entry of the soldier Alexander Somerville, it was rumoured that the BPU intended to march on London, and they were to be stopped by the military. The army had been ordered to rough-sharpen their swords for the first time since Waterloo, which further increased tensions and made soldiers believe that they were on the verge of actually fighting with their fellow countrymen. It is not clear whether Wellesley could have relied upon the loyalty of his troops to fight in a civil war against their own countrymen, and Wellesley understood the threat of economic instability posed by a bank run. Ultimately, the reform crisis, known as the Days of May, ended because Wellesley could not form a government, as many Tories were still angry at him about Catholic emancipation in 1829, and obviously Sir Robert Peel never joined his government, largely due to the fact that he didn't want to risk his popularity anymore by supporting a reform bill. This resulted in the resignation of Wellesley and the formation of a new Whig government by Earl Grey on May 15th. King William IV had promised Earl Grey that he would support a new reform bill if the Whigs formed a government. The Fourth Reform Bill was then able to pass, as the Tory MPs and Tory Lords feared revolution if another bill received a veto, so they allowed it to pass, and we had the passing of the 1832 Great Reform Act on June 7th. So that's it for the